So
Okay.
so that was a very illuminating and very fascinating discussion on China. So to close out this cycle of discussion on civilization and civilizational continuity, um, I think we ought to, kind of speak a little bit more, speak a little bit about Russia and their unique position in the world order. While today their position in the world order, especially to millennials, whose memories do not include, whose living memories do not include the memory of the Cold War or the Berlin Wall. Today, Russia may seem like a relatively diminished power, especially in the size of their economy or the diminishing population and so on, and seen more as a resource provider and a provider of sophisticated military hardware and sophisticated software engineers. But especially in the last 400 or so years, Russia has probably played a very important role in world history. And given its unique position of being of the West and yet not of the West, in some sense. So, as they say, the old saying is, scratch a Russian and find a Tatar. And so that is their sense. And they seem to keep balancing between this European sensibility and the Asiatic sensibility of the steppe. So where do you see them, and where do you see their position vis-a-vis the mainstream Anglo-Saxon and Western Catholic civilization?
Okay, so if you would permit me, I would take a longer arc, that is going back to the genesis of the Russians and then come to our age. Should we do it that way, or do you want to do it some other way?
No, I would definitely, appreciate your perspective from a longer time frame kind of thing. So definitely, please do go ahead.
So the first thing we should know from the ancient time is that the Russians are in a sense related to us. So of the Indo-European groups, we have the Indo-Iranians, and the next closest sister group to us are the Balts and the Slavs. So the Balts include the Lithuanians, whom we discussed previously, and one of the Slavic groups are the Russians. Now, that ancient Slavic past, of that we have little to nothing, unfortunately. It would have been a great thing if something, even a little bit, had survived. I think it would have illuminated our own prehistory to a great degree. Now, there is something called the Book of Velus, which they claim is like a Russian Veda from the past, but for most part, people believe it to be a fake, which has been made in the last century or the century before that, inspired by the Hindu Veda. So the Book of Velus, we cannot place any trust in that. And so we have practically nothing of Russian prehistory, apart from the genetic evidence which tells us that as a sister group of the Balts, they are in turn a sister group to us and the Iranians. And they sort of remain close to the old homeland of the Indo-Europeans and didn't move too much. And their organization, ironically, was due to impulses from the West. So if we look at the Indo-European branching, it's now fairly clear that Balto-Slavic plus Indo-Iranian is one higher order grouping. But there were many branches outside of this grouping which moved, most of whom moved to the West, one of whom are the Germanic people. And the Germanic people who reached the extreme north of Europe, Scandinavia, at some point they had an efflorescence, which we can very loosely term the Viking efflorescence. So these Vikings mark a phase of exploration through maritime as well as riverine modes and land armies too, which spread across a wide swath of the Western world. And one such Viking leader family or royal family, to use it in a very colloquial sense, a prince, a Viking lord, Helgi. He seems to have organized the first Khaganate of the Rus. Now, they are actually termed the Khaganate of the Rus, even in an early letter of the Jewish Khaganate. So the one proselytizing success which the Jews had was of the Khazar Khaganate. So the Khazars were a class of Turks who emerged as an offshoot, a branch of the Blue Turks, whom we briefly alluded to in our discussion on China, who were a major power on the steppes after the collapse of the Hun Khaganate. So a branch of them were the Khazars, who converted to Judaism due to the proselytizing activities of some rabbis. And this Jewish Khaganate of the Turks, one of the authors within them refers to this Khaganate of the Rus under Helgi. And in its Slavic form, he's known as Oleg. So Oleg was the first one of Germanic ancestry who organized the Rus kingdom, or the Khaganate of the Rus. And he launched some far-ranging invasions. At one point, he went as far as to attack Constantinople itself, which was under the Christian Byzantines at that time. And subsequently, he waged wars against, he and his clan waged wars against the Khazar Jewish Turks and the Arabs, and met with considerable success, expanding their Khaganate. So in its very conception as a Khaganate, it had a certain Eastern feel to it, even though the founders of it ironically came from the Germanic West. So right in the foundation of this Rus Khaganate, you see the admixture of the East, West, and the Indo-European center. So in terms of the populace itself, the majority were the Slavic-speaking Russians, ancestors of the Russians. They were Slavs. The leadership came from the Germanic tribes of Scandinavia, Vikings like Helgi or Oleg. And in terms of the title and the general state organization, they were influenced by the Jewish Turks of the Khazar Khaganate and other heathen Turks further south, east, so on. So you see this amalgamation. And there are some findings in those northern realms of Iranic remnants or archaeological signs of Iranic religion, of the steppe Iranians, which is a non-Zoroastrian strain of the Iranic religion closer to our own religion, which remained behind on the steppes. Like the finds of two interesting bowls with images of the transfunctional goddess whom we identify as Durga, and the Iranics would have identified as the equivalent of Durga as Nana, whom they would have seen as the equivalent of the as the wife of their cognate of Rudra, that is effectively Vayu. So the findings of these Iranic elements, the Khazar-Turkish interactions, suggest that the early Viking-ruled state of the Rus was already a multi-ethnic state, where you find contacts from both East and the West, and long-range trade contacts which were bringing in material from as far as India. There was a Russian archaeologist called Kozulov, I think was his name, who claimed that he even found an image of Vishnu somewhere in this Rus domain. But my own examination of the purported idol, and I'm not even sure if that icon was the actual one which the archaeologists found. It's not Vishnu, but likely the same goddess, the cognate of Durga. But anyhow, it points to these contacts with as far as the Indic world, definitely with the Eastern Iranian world on one side, the Jewish Kaghanate on the other, the Arabs with whom they were in conflict, and the Germanic world of the Vikings. So, right at its origin, you see that the Rus kingdom was a multi-ethnic one with contacts around the map. Subsequently, they underwent a conversion in large part due to the conversion of one of the queens. And this conversion was not per se to the Western strains of Christianity, but it was to the Byzantine strain, the same Byzantine force which Oleg had defeated. And the Byzantines had tried hard to fight him, even they tried to poison Oleg, but they failed in all those attempts. But their eventual success, ironically, came through this mechanism of conversion of the Rus. So the Rus now post-conversion, and it looks as though the conversion was relatively superficial to begin with, and it mainly involved this Viking elite who converted to this the Church of Byzantium, which was the Eastern Orthodox Church. And that was in itself an important event. So you see them set apart from the Western Church, Catholicism, and its adherents, even amidst the Slavs who were more to the Western domain, got converted to Catholicism. Like, say, the primary divide between Poland and Russia even today is between Catholicism and the Eastern Church of Orthodox Christianity, which came from the Byzantine rulers. So this conversion was definitely a very ugly affair, as all Christian conversions necessarily are. It involved a demolition of the temple of Perkunyas, or Perun, who is the cognate of Parjanya, the Indra class deity. So there was a very dramatic image of his, which was housed at a temple in the capital of the Rus. And there is an account of the conversion where that image was demolished and thrown into a river. So Christianity came with its usual evils, even to Russia. But over time, it seeped into the population. And there was one key event which the conversion to Christianity marked. It brought in the sentiment of the Holy War. And one such holy war is recorded in one of the earliest records of the Russian language, which is Igor's Lay, or a very interesting poem written in the old Russian language of one of the successors of Oleg, Igor, his holy war against the Kipchak Turks. So we see these guys waging their own Eastern Orthodox variant of the Crusades against the heathen Turks. So these were not the same as the Khazar or the Jewish Turks. These were still the heathen Turks, and the Russians launched some crusades into them, into their territory, the Holy War. But despite that, there was a certain balance of power between the Kipchak Kaghanate of these Turks and the Rus Kaghanate. And they had marriage relationships. So there again, you see a certain anchor to the east, to the Turkic east, in the form of the marriage between these Kaghanates. And over time, the Rus Kaghanate, it broke up into smaller princedoms, a period of disunity, but they all sort of had an alliance with each other. You see different power centers, like in Kiev, which was one major power center of these Rus, of the Rus princes. Now, they appear next an important event in their history was the catastrophic encounter with the Mongols. So Chinggis Khan, who was chasing Jalal al-Din of the Khawarizm Sultanate. So the Khawarizm Sultanate, its original ruler Muhammad had been defeated and he died. And his son Jalal al-Din was continuing the jihad. And Chinggis Khan chased him. And in course of that chase, he sent two of his greatest generals, Subedai Bhagatur and Jebe Noyan, on a reconnaissance expedition. So smashing their way through the Islamic army, they moved further west and moving on either side of the Caspian, they eventually reached the Rus and launched a devastating attack on the Rus princes. The Rus, it was at the height of winter, and the Rus horsemen, they had their horses with iron shoes. And the Mongol horses did not have iron shoes, so they were able to easily cross the frozen river. Whereas the Rus horses with their iron shoes, they broke the ice on the river and they started freezing to death in the cold water as the Mongols were shooting at them from either bank. And the end was a disastrous defeat, and 4 of those Russian princes were captured, and they were smothered to death under a large wooden plank on top of which the Mongol leaders had a victory feast. So that was the humiliation which
the humiliation and the kind of wanton cruelty is like unimaginable.
Well, that's how we would see it today. But the Mongol thinking was that they, being royalty, that not a drop of their blood should be shed. So they should be killed in such a way that their blood doesn't come out of their body. So they decided that the best way is to smother them under this plank where they had their feast. So the Mongol, yeah.
I will just interject here to show our viewers the scale of what was achieved in this, the Great Raid. In a 6-year period, you can see how they cut across the entire swath and, they hit the gates of Vienna and then wrecked, they in Hungary and across Eastern Europe and the Slavic lands. They seem to have left a massive trail of violence and, invasion and slaughter and so on in just these 4 years. So this was just to give our viewers a sense of the scale of what happened.
So I should make one little correction. This was the subsequent campaign under Chinggis Khan's son, Ogodai. But during Chinggis's reign itself, Jebe and Subedai, they launched their attack on the Rus. And
let me try to find Jebe and Subedai.
You may find even a picture by a Russian artist of those 4 princes, Mstislav and others, being smothered to death under this plank.
Right.
So if you want to show the viewers, feel free.
No, I probably don't want to show such gruesome figures.
I'm not suggesting that you do it, but I know I have seen such a painting by a Russian artist.
Fairly gruesome. Yeah, this is probably what you mean. Let me share my screen. Is this the one you mean? The Volga Bulgars and then the hit across.
Yes. So this is the 1218, 1211, all those are during the reign of Chinggis Khan, and 1223. Yeah. So all that is the first wave. Yeah. So
that's probably
this famous movement across the or along the Caspian and the hit on the Rus. You can see Kiev right there in the corner. So that's the Jebe Subedai campaign. So anyhow, so after this humiliating defeat and the subsequent Mongol invasions, like the earlier map which you showed, so there were in Ogodai's reign, there were further invasions launched. The grandson of Chinggis Khan, Batu, along with Subedai, launched a second attack, which penetrated even deeper into Slavic lands and the Hungarian lands. And there is a certain custom amidst the Poles where they blow a tune on the horn only halfway, because the guy who was warning the city by blowing his horn, a Mongol arrow cut him down when he was halfway through the tune which he was blowing on his horn. So to this day, they remember that event by just blowing the horn halfway through the tune, as it happened to that guy who was killed. And it was in that campaign they probably used the first event of aerial bombardment in history, where they had guys tied to giant kites, and they flew the kites up, and then those guys tied to the kites threw down bombs from the air. So this was an early occasion of aerial bombardment. So anyhow, all that history consequence was the conquest of the Rus, who came under what was called the Tatar yoke. Now, the Tatars are not the Mongols. They were a tribe in Mongolia who were actually inimical to Chinggis Khan's clan. So they killed Chinggis Khan's father when he was taking Chinggis out to find his wife. And subsequently, when the Khan came to power, one of the tribes which he wiped out was that of the Tatars. But the Russians, for some reason, kept using the name of these enemies, the Tatars. And there may be a reason for that, because in the earlier campaign of Chinggis Khan's father, Yasugei, he heard of his eldest son being born when he captured or killed a Tatar chief called Temujin. So it was a tough fight, evidently, so he named his own son as Temujin. And that was the original name of the Khan. Chinggis Khan is just a title. But this Mongol yoke, as the Russians call it, and it had a threefold effect, one could say. One, it was a matter of humiliation. But it also created a nationalist sentiment, because when you're under foreign rule, you tend to have a certain resentment. And the Mongol rule was certainly not taken by the Russians as something which they like too much, or at least that's the modern interpretation. There was probably some element of truth to that. But when you have this resentment, you have a unification. So the Russian Khaganate, which was now subsumed under the Mongol Khaganate, a certain unity of Russian ethnicity started coming about. The second factor was that under the Mongol rule, they acquired many features of Mongol warfare. And this was actually a positive, I would say. So they became more in tune with the developments in steppe warfare and the Mongol style of fighting. The third, and that was to be of great importance, as we'll see downstream. And the third factor was the administration. So definitely certain administrative reforms with Chinggis Khan, and importantly his son Ogodai, who ascended the throne as Dalayin Khan, instituted. The Rus passively imbibed some of those taxation systems, revenue systems, like the Mongol system of taking a certain, where the government will take some money from you, but it will invest it in various ventures, and whatever it profits out of that, it will be put back into public works. So there were some administrative devices which the Rus acquired from the Mongols. Now the Mongol Empire, as it weakened, and Islamized in the West, it had a contrast again came about. The Mongol rulers, the heathen Mongols like the Khan, the great Khan and Ogode and the like, they were secular in the Indian sense. But after Islamization, there was obviously a clash between the Orthodox Rus, Orthodox Christian Rus, and the Islamic Mongols. And the final great clash where the Mongols held the upper hand was during Khan Toktamish of the Western Khaganate, the guys who descended from Chinggis Khan's eldest son, Jochi. Those Mongols. Khan Toktamish, during his Western campaign, which struck both Lithuania and Russia, his attack on the Russians, he penetrated as far as Moscow and burned down Moscow to the ground. So that was a further humiliation at the hands of the Mongols. And it was at that point that a certain Russian national consciousness started rising to overthrow the Mongol reign or the Mongol rule. And if this was achieved over a long period, where the tables were turned. But the first major event was the defeat of Khan Mame of the same horde by Dmitry Donsky, or Dmitry of the Don. And this Russian Khan, or Russian Tsar, if we were to call them now by the Byzantine title of the Caesar, he had learned the tactics of the steppe warfare, and he turned the tables. He used the same trick very resolutely against Khan Mame and defeated him comprehensively, re-establishing the Russian power and overthrowing the Mongol yoke. And
just a question here. By this time, was the shift from the Western Slavic region of Kievan Rus to the core Slavic region of Muscovy? Had that power shift already happened, or was it still yet in its infancy?
It had happened. It had happened. So one point to note is that the burning down of Moscow, it sort of temporarily set that back because Moscow was completely destroyed. But still, Moscow was remembered as being the center that they came back to it, and they were able to they re-established it after the destruction of Moscow. So
during this period of the Mongol, between the establishment of the Khaganate, the Rus Khaganate of Rus, and the Mongol invasions, there's roughly around 450 years. How did the ruling class change? Did the ruling class continue to be Germanic, Teutonic, or / Viking in nature, or had it nativized and become the ruling class had become, mostly Slavic with some co-opted Russian characteristics? I mean,
so definitely the Slavicization was continually increasing. So over that period, it became increasingly Slavic, if that makes sense.
Yes. So as you see, the eastward movement, plus by the time the Genghis Khan, time of Genghis Khan and the Mongol / Tatar yoke, before the Tatar yoke started, the genesis of the modern Russian identity and the state, the Russian, if I may call it the Rashtra, the Rus Rashtra, had already been completed in terms of its core holy geography centered around the Moscow, St. Petersburg region, and the ruling class, which was a Slavic Orthodox Christian ruling class.
So as I said, there was a fragmentation. So the Orthodoxy came in the later part of the Viking leadership. After that, in the period of fragmentary, there were the dukes. Each of the rulers of the centers were termed dukes. So there was the Duchy of Muscovy. So that was one center. Now, there was similarly one at Ryazan, there was one in Kiev. But once the Kievan Rus disintegrated under the Mongol assault, and the principality of Moscow, the power started centering in it. The shift started occurring in that direction. Now, it was not that during the period of when the Golden Horde, as the Jochid Khaganate was termed, was in power, the Rus were totally out of control. There were periods where some of these duchies acquired their own, they acquired a degree of independence, you could say, or they were feudatories with a degree of independence. But the pivotal event was this battle under the leadership of Dmitry of Moscow. Importantly, he was the Prince of Moscow. And he smashed the Mongol army in 1380 in the battlefield of Kulikovo. So for the Russians, it is like a Mahabharata-like event for the founding of their nation. And even in the Soviet period, you can see that they made paintings of that pivotal event, which are very anachronistic, of course, some of them which I have seen. But they present it like a heroic battle between Khan Mame and Dmitry, fighting like two heroes, like, say, a Mahabharata battle between two yodhas. So it was a very important event in the Russian consciousness of the overthrow of Mongol power and the return of the Russian power. Now, the chronicle which describes it says that Dmitry had fielded a very large army, but even modern historians feel that that might be an exaggeration. Like, I think if I may not be remembering the number precisely, but the Russians claim that they fielded an army of over 100,000. But even if it were not that much, it might have been lesser than that, but perhaps something in that range, closer to that rather than much lesser. It gave the first hint of a Russian force which could amass a large amount of manpower, which was quite unprecedented on their part before that. And it was to foreshadow many events down to times closer to our own, like World War II, where this kind of consciousness was raised of the defense of Mother Russia as they present it. So there's a lot of patina which is quoted the original events of the Battle of Kulikovo, but despite that, we may say that it was a very pivotal event in their consciousness. Now,
I just want to interject here with a question.
Okay.
Now we are now that you describe the Battle of Kulikovo and the struggle between the Tatar or the Turkic elements, the steppe Turkic elements, the Mongols and the Slavic Russians. See, much is made of a certain earlier event that happened, especially in the 20th century. Much was made of the earlier event that happened, which was the invasion of the Teutonic Knights and the defense of Novgorod by Prince Alexander Nevsky. And even today, the Mamayev Kurgan is supposed to be some kind of place of pilgrimage for Russians. Was it entirely myth-making, or was it as pivotal and important a battle as is spoken of?
Which one?
The Alexander Nevsky, the Battle of Novgorod, the battle on the ice, which was very dramatically presented in cinema.
I have not. I don't watch movies, so I have not seen that movie. But perhaps we could. Maybe we'll come to that in a certain context as we come closer to our times. That is when you place it in the context of World War II, suddenly that seems like a pivotal event because
Right.
it marks this clash between the Germanic West and the Slavic Russian core. So Hitler saw himself as the Teutonic Knights conquering Russia in a sense, and for the despite them being the Soviet communists, to rouse the average Russian, this event may have played a major mental role. It would have played well into that mental imagery of the defense of Mother Russia against the Germans.
So when we come to that that part, where the of the clash between the Catholic West and Russia, when we come to that part, I'd probably do a small divergence to tell our viewers about the significance of Alexander Nevsky to Second World War, and also the significance of that movie in movie history. It's a very critical movie in movie history. So I'll probably do a small divergence.
I'm totally unaware of that. So yeah. So I guess that's something where I'll just listen.
Okay.
Since
sorry about the interjection.
No problem at all. That is, I was not even aware that such a movie was made of this thing. So there are some very deep blind spots in my in my thinking. But I think if we were to look at history per se, I would not place this event as being as important as the overthrow of the Mongol regime, or the Tatar yoke, as the Russians like to call it.
Right.
Because this was Novgorod, and the period after that, the Russian power was still pretty weak, and it may have sort of assuaged, the way I look at it is, it may have assuaged the Russian pride, because this event happened a little after the defeat of the other princes by the Mongols, the complete smashing by the Mongols. So after that, when you gain a certain victory, it can feel good, and that's my interpretation of it. But it did not mean that they had defeated the crusading knights of Germany. After all, it was presented as a crusade. It was a continuation of the crusade against the pagan Balts. These Teutonic knights were conducting the Livonian crusade, if I remember right. And it was an extension of the Livonian crusade to attack the Rus.
Yes.
So, in that sense, staving that off assuaged Russian pride. However, it did not mean that the state was by any means an eschewed phenomenon, or its survival was in question, because like Khan Tokhtamysh's attack and burning down of Moscow meant that they could come under a Tatar yoke again. So, in whatever the case, the Battle of Kulikovo, in my opinion, was important. It did not mean the end of the Mongol reign. It simply meant that the Russians had defeated the Mongols in a comprehensive way, and while the Mongol Khaganate continued to fight and gain victories even after that, it was like a turning point. It's just like, to use an analogy in cricket, the first time India ever beat England, I think, it gave them the confidence that they could at least win a test match. So it was that kind of an event with respect to the Mongols. And I don't know if you watch cricket. I'm just generalizing here, since That's something which Indians tend to, that's an analogy which Indians tend to use.
The 1983 win, which was supposed to be
or
the
the 1983 World Cup, which was perhaps the first cricket which I watched. I think we had just got the TV in our house then. So, it was a huge event. It showed that we could even beat the West Indies, which at that time was
all powerful.
Right. So it didn't mean that the Mongol power ended at Kulikovo, or that the Mongol victories over Russia stopped after Kulikovo. But it showed that the Russians could beat the Mongols comprehensively, and it gave them a new life or a new confidence. But let's not linger about all the events. Even I would have to actually look up some details of all the many battles which took place following Kulikovo, since it was not a straight path that the Mongols vanished after Kulikovo. There was a back and forth. It was a seesaw battle. In a sense, it was like Vijayanagara and the Islamic frontier in South India, where there was a seesaw movement going on for a while between the two sides. So, but we'll skip some of those events, but at some point, the Rus started turning the table on the Khaganates, and they started pursuing the conquests into the Mongol lands. And with Peter, the Tsar Peter, you saw the first great modernization of the Russian army. And this, until that point, you could see them as being more or less a steppe power. They had adopted many of the Mongolian tactics, and the Kipchak Khaganate, with whom they had interactions earlier, the Turkic Khaganate. So the Turco-Mongol system still dominated the Russian mind, so to say, or the military tactics. But it was with the Tsar Peter that you saw a shift towards more Western tactics, modernization of the artillery, and Western European norms or Western European ideals of military conquest. They entered the Russian mind, and over a protracted period, systematically they destroyed the Mongol Khaganates all the way to Crimea in the southwestern side, and on the eastern side, their expansion into Siberia, which is known after Khan Shibir, another Mongol ruler, is in a way equivalent to the Western Europeans' expansion into the Americas. So this fact is often underplayed. It's seen as though the Russians never explored any territory, never went into lands far outside their own. But the expansion into Siberia, while it was entirely a land expansion, unlike the maritime expansions of the Western European powers, they were definitely parallel. The Russians did accumulate a body of knowledge similar to the Western Europeans in their colonial ventures as they moved into Siberia. And the conquest of Siberia was a very critical event for them, because it gave them a certain strategic depth, which was going to be very important for them in World War II, for example. Some role of that was seen even earlier when the Napoleonic Wars took place and Napoleon's invasion of Russia. There were remarkable parallels to the German invasion during the Nazi campaign against the Rus. In that, the Rus were retreating. So in a sense, they used the old tactic of the steppe, of the feigned retreat, until they got their enemy in a compromised position. And ironically, the Mamayev Kurgan, where the stand against the Germans took place, is named after that same Khan Mamay who was defeated by Dmitry on the dawn of the Battle of Kulikovo. So this conquest of the East, it gave them the strategic depth. It also brought them in contact with the Qing China. And the beginning of the Sino-Russian conflict was already seen as part of that. And you know, in a more academic sense, the Russian interest in the East, similar to the Western Europeans developing an interest in India and the emergence of white Indology. Similarly, the Russians developed their own Sinology and Japanology, to which they made some useful contributions. Anyhow, I'm being a bit anachronistic, but all this is a bloviation primarily on your first question of Russia being at the crossroads, so to say, between the East and the West.
Yeah.
And the conquest of
from
Siberia,
the center, somewhat at the center of Eurasia, they at one point in time, maybe during the peak of the Soviet Union or even during the times of the Romanov Tsars, they fairly dominated Eurasia as a power.
Correct. So that the reason I went into this was to say that the Siberian conquest, in a sense, only reaffirmed that Eastern connection, which became very important to them when they were facing the crisis of the Nazi invasion. So, in any case, the dominance of Eurasia meant that they were going to come into clash with other powers. For example, after the collapse of the Marathas in India, we have now fast forwarded way from Peter, we have come to the 1800s. But I think that's an important period where a number of events of note happened. Again, I'm being a bit anachronistic, but I think it's the themes more than the historical timeline, which any person can just look up a book of history or do a search online. So I'm not going to be doing that job. This is just to sort of try to distill some insights, if you may call them the insights at all. But so after the collapse of the Maratha power in the Anglo-Maratha wars, starting the downward slide of the Marathas starting from 1803, by 1820, the conquest of India from the Marathas and other powers, more or less, and then the collapse of the Sikh Empire meant that the English were the dominant force in India. The Western Europeans also had designs on China, which we saw with the Opium Wars. So it meant that as a dominant land power straddling West and East, Russia was going to very naturally come into conflict with the Western European powers, which had their eyes on Asia too. So India was seen as a very obvious source for enriching themselves by the Western Europeans. And as they were involved in the plunder of India, the Rus were watching warily because they also had an eye on it. And while it never amounted to anything, there were attempts by the Rus to somehow connect up with the Hindu, I would call them Hindu, but the somewhat secular-minded Hindu fight back in 1857. It would have been a very interesting thing if we did connect with the Rus in that period, but nothing came up to that, even though the Rus sent some exploratory emissaries. And then there was the so-called Great Game, where the English sent explorers, including a Kashmirian Brahmana with young husband, into Central Asia. And this was directly infringing on the Russian domain. So the Great Game was a clash between the English who had occupied India and the Rus who were expanding southwards, conquering the former Turk and Mongolic lands. Now, a very important event at this point and this is how I interpret history, that was the clash within Christianity. So I see that the Russians saw themselves as they were conquering these territories as the force within Christianity. They saw themselves as the leaders of the Christian world. And this was in a direct clash with the two centers of the West, Catholicism and the rebellion, the counter religion against Catholicism, that is Protestantism. And one of their foci for both these powers was none other than Jerusalem, the root of all Abrahamisms. So, of all three Abrahamisms. So, both Rus and the West tried to gain a certain control of Jerusalem. And the Russians did come very close, if I remember right, to taking Jerusalem or taking Constantinople, which was the foundation of their own Orthodox Church. And in this process of presenting themselves as the leader of the Christian world, what they did was to break up the Osman Empire of the Turks. So during the great jihad of Suleiman, the lawgiver, as he's called, the Osman Empire emperor who took the Osmans to their zenith. So he came very close to Vienna, and he's in his jihad on the West. He totally destroyed the Hungarians and smashed the Knights of Malta. And it was an all-round victory for Islam. At that point in the East, there was the tyrant Akbar, who was destroying the Hindus in India, and he was still in his jihadi days. And in the West, Suleiman was trampling over the Christians. So if at that point in history, everyone would have thought that it was going to be an Islamic century. But things turned and the focus shifted to Christianity. But what is commonly ignored is that there were two centers of Christianity, at least two centers: the Rus Orthodox Eastern Church and the Western Protestant and Catholic churches.
So at this point, I'd like to, probably interject to point out some kind of self-image that the Rus have of themselves. There is one part where Ivan the Terrible, the first Tsar, the first person who actually called himself a Tsar, Ivan the Terrible is supposed to have said that two Romes fell. We are the third Rome, and we shall not fall. And this
very
again
important
parallels.
Point.
This again parallels all the, any tyrant or any great conqueror in the Western Europe usually thinks of themselves as the inheritor of Rome, whether it is Charlemagne or Napoleon or even later Hitler, who thought of himself as the inheritor of the Germanic Holy Roman Empire. And they all lay claims to being the true successor to Rome, in a sense.
And in this regard, I should point out that even Suleiman saw himself as Caesar. Right. So it extended even to the Islamic world. So he in the long inscription in his famous masjid in Istanbul, he uses many phrases, and I don't recall all the phrases, but one of the phrases is he's Caliph of the Mohammedans, which of course he was, and he's Caesar. He's also Caesar at the same time. So he remembers the fact that he's ruling what was once Constantinople, the seat of the Caesar, and Caesar used in the general term, in a general sense. So that did have a very pervasive influence even on the Turkic Khaganate of the Osmans. And he calls himself other things, like he says he's like the shadow of Allah on the earth. He's like Jesus in his piety or something like that. So he appropriates both the Christian and the Islamic side, and also the old Turkic. He calls himself the Great Khagan in a Turkic or Mongolic fashion. So anyhow, but the contest within Christianity meant that the Russians played a major role in the liberation of those places in Eastern Europe, which had been conquered during the jihads of Salim and Suleiman, and before that, Mehmet, who conquered Constantinople. So the liberation of Romania and Eastern European states which were under Islamic rule, the Rus played a very important role in that. And this is commonly ignored in Western tellings of history, that how much of the liberation of Eastern Europe from Islam was due to the Russian support. And in this period, there was something which happened, which in a sense extended an old trope. Suleiman himself had sent, at the height of his power, emissaries to France and Britain, and they had, on paper, become his allies. So Western Europe, the two Western European powers, France and England, were now allied with Suleiman, a Turkic power. And he was in war with the Rus to a degree, but at that point, the Rus were not his primary focus by any means. But Eastern Europeans like Hungarians and even the Germans, like the Germanic people in Vienna, the Poles. So all these were enemies of the Turks, the Osman Turks. So this interesting alliance, which you see starting right at that period, meant that there was an Islamo-Christian alliance of the extreme Western Christian side and the Islamic Caliphate in the center. And that was pitted against Eastern Europeans, and it extended to the Russians over time. And the crystallization of this schism in the Christian world was seen in the famous war which was fought between the Crimean War, between the French and the British on one side and the Russians on the other. So the Russians put up a very resolute defense of their cities. For example, Sevastopol, which was completely destroyed by the British-French alliance. But what was the cause of this war? The cause of this war was the Russian conflict with the Turks. So the Turkish navy fell into the hands. They were all moored in one place, and the Russians saw an opportunity to smash the Osman navy. And they launched a surprise attack on it and sunk all their ships. And this alarmed the English and the French, seeing that the Russians were gaining a naval foothold in the Black Sea. So that was something which they could not tolerate, since they prided themselves as the true naval powers, amidst other things, and also as the true powers, probably as the true arbitrators of the Christian world. So they allied with an Islamic power, the dying Turkish Sultanate of the Osmans, against the Rus to fight the Crimean War, where despite the resolute effort of the Russian generals, it ended in what one could only term a defeat of the Russians. So this was that other point of reckoning, that inflection point. They had fought off Napoleon, even though it was at a huge human cost, and he advanced considerably to the east. But the feigned retreat tactic had worked, and Tsar Alexander eventually won the conflict, and Napoleon retreated in a disastrous defeat, losing most of his army. But now the English-French alliance had launched an attack right into the heart of the Russian zone of influence, and had inflicted a defeat on the Russian forces in the Crimean War. So this second point of reckoning, maybe there were others along the line, but I place the Mongol defeat as one, and the recovery from that starting with Dmitry Donskoy's victory at Kulikovo. And then this point where they realized that they were not really up to mark. And then the third point of reckoning came even closer to our times, when in the East there was a new power on the rise in the form of Japan. And we can take a brief detour here to talk a bit about Japan, very little about
yeah, but before we take the detour into Japan, there are a couple of observations that came out that I'd like to make in your telling of this history. There are two themes that there are some themes actually that really stand out. One of that is that how the Western Catholic West, how Russia has always had aspiration to have a warm water entry through the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, and how for a very long time Western Catholic Europe has thwarted that ambition by an alliance with the Asia Minor power, which is the Turkic, the Turkey, which is the Ottoman Turkey. And this has continued for nearly 300, 350 years, right from the time of Ivan onwards, when Elizabeth was ruling England and Ivan was in Russia, to again the start of the Victorian age, when just before the Victorian age, when again this need was thwarted. And again during the Second World War period, the First World War and then the Second World War, and even today, when always the Russian advance into Crimea and therefore a consolidation and an entry into the Mediterranean is constantly thwarted through a partner. And one probably thinks that the real value for Turkey, the value that Turkey holds in the Western scheme of things, is as this leverage point against Russia, or this choke point against Russia.
Absolutely. Now, one point I'll say, not to contradict you, but I should just stress on it, that it's a Catholic come Protestant.
Right.
It is, these two are in conflict with themselves, but when it comes to Russia, the counter religion of Protestantism and the older Catholic strain, they ally against the Orthodox, who are seen as nearly heathen with respect to their heresy, or they are seen as a heresy with respect to the Catholic Protestant combined. Now, the Orthodox harbor a similar feeling. It's a mutual Abrahamistic antagonism between them. Now, one important point to note in this is the modern state of Israel and its predecessors, the Jews, who played an important role in the Ottoman Empire. So there were some Jewish advisors to the Ottoman sultans, and one of them had lent some money and done some business with the French, and the French did not pay him back for the financial services this Jewish official of the Ottomans had offered to the French ruler. And so he was able to call upon the Ottoman Sultan to punish the French severely. And so the Ottomans attacked the French ships when they came to Egypt and confiscated all their goods as a punishment. And probably the Jewish advisor of the Sultan and financial backer of the French, he got back his investment through this confiscation. So the presence of a Jewish state or a Jewish power within the Ottoman domain is not something completely unexpected. It was already in place even in the Ottoman period. And one could see the modern Israel as some kind of an extension of the role played by the Jewish advisors to some of the sultans of the Ottoman Empire. That's just a little aside in this.
Yeah, so we can go back to the main theme that you were exploring, which is that of the Japanese encounter in 1905.
Yes, right. So Japan is an interesting case. Japan is a topic in itself, but it's not my specialty, and it's sort of peripheral to the history which we are talking about right now, except for this clash with Russia and the events which follow. So one point to note is that they early on acquired this legalistic philosophy from China, and that was a very central event in the foundation of their own consciousness. But one thing of the Japanese people, if the Chinese had a certain genius of the social engineering through carrot and stick, the Japanese had a certain genius of placing a filter. They had a very good filter to what used to come into their country. So the Chinese did show susceptibility to the fads, but the Japanese were much less susceptible to fads because of that filter which they placed. And whatever would come in would have to pass through that filter. So it won't come in as is, but even the legalism filtered through. It did not displace the basic Shinto ideals, which we see in the original Nihon Kojiki, the oldest Shinto text, which has come down to us. And what it contributed to was, though, a certain form of centering on the emperor, which allowed the reunification after periods of fragmentation. It was that same filter which allowed Japan to proactively acquire what was useful from European tradition. And this included a variety of things, ranging from mathematics and medicine on one side to technology. The Japanese Buddha monks or Buddha teachers, acharyas, they were pretty good at manufacturing guns. And we have evidence that even during the reign of the Japanese tyrant, Oda, they were making Nobunaga. They were making good guns. So there were several Buddha clans which specialize about not clans but Buddha bhikshus who defended their religious institutions by making these good guns. So they had a certain technological prior which they could now, an artistic tradition, metal smelting tradition and the like, which they could marry with Western influences, which they let pass through this filter. Now, we have to acknowledge the fact that they went through a period where the filter completely shut down, and it was the arrival of the Americans and subsequently Yoshida Shoin's realization of the need to open up the filter a bit to let in what was necessary, that allowed the Meiji reforms and the new Japan to arise. So this unique combination of circumstance, just like England has a very unique combination of circumstance, Japan also has its very unique combination of circumstance, allowed it to develop a remarkable military force. It was always a good military power. We had seen how during the Ming period, they inflicted a crushing defeat on the Koreans, and they even had an audacious plan under Hideyoshi to conquer Beijing itself from the Ming. While they did not achieve that, they were still able to put several 100,000 men to war and ship them across the Sea of Japan and hit Korea really hard, despite the Ming backing their Korean allies. So they had a strong tradition of military expeditionary activity, which now combined with this with the new Japan post the Meiji Reformation, made them an unexpected power. And when they correctly gamed that when the Western Europeans were subjugating China, unlike India, which the British conquered, the next target, China, was not conquered by occupation per se, because there was a conflict between all the Western European powers and Russia that as to who would take China. So they realized that if the Brits took China just like they took India, they would be, in a sense, the world conquerors, unprecedented world conquerors. So the other Western European powers and Russia and America too now arranged, that is USA, arranged that no one Mlecha power would dominate China, but it would instead be cut up like a cake amidst all of them, and they would all have a combined influence on China. Japan correctly saw this as a grave threat on its flank, and it saw that the Qing were declining. They had already been weakened by all these jihads and rebellions, which we discussed earlier. So they attacked the Qing and conquered some territory there. So the Japanese sort of forced themselves on the table with the Western powers, and now the Western powers had to concede a role for Japan in this suppressed or the subjugated China. And having gained a place at the table, Russia became the next target because there were Russian ambitions which obviously affected the Japanese sphere of influence, like that of Sakhalin.
Yeah, their aspirations are, they still haven't seemed to have let go of their aspirations, which is the Kamchatka Peninsula, the Kuril Islands, or Sakhalin.
Yes,
especially.
Right, and in the past it was a Japanese territory which now has been conquered by the Russians after World War II, but the clash was inevitable. So the modernized Japanese army defeated the Russians to enforce or to secure their flank. And this was again a moment of reckoning. Despite the chemical weapons which Dmitry Mendeleev, the inventor of the periodic table, made for the Russians, it was a disastrous defeat. And the Russians were exposed in many ways. This warm water port, which you mentioned, was one major factor. They sailed all the way around Africa to reach the eastern coast adjacent to Japan. And in that long and slow movement, they lost the strategic initiative and were completely outclassed in the naval conflict with Japan. So this, I would say this was the third point of reckoning when the Rus realized that they had to, that is, it was again humiliating. In many ways for them, it seemed like the Mongol defeat. It was a defeat by an Asiatic power, especially given that at this point they saw themselves more as a Christian Western power, but they had been defeated by an Asiatic power who, in their mental projection, was not very different from the Mongols. And importantly, the Japanese were a heathen power. So Christianity had also been, the Christian leadership of the Christian world had also taken a big beating at the hands of Japan. So I think it was these which, in a sense, forged the Russian urge for becoming even greater in power. That is, there was a certain inward soul searching, so to say, to try to acquire a greater power, and eventually, so there was a hatred for Japan, which was completely, it went beyond all bounds. They were seeking revenge at all costs, and it was to come in World War II. So a combination of these events were to shape Russia, but the dramatic event of the revolution happened shortly after these events. That is the defeat of Russia by the Japanese. And that completely set them back for at least a couple of decades. And I would very controversially propose that this revolution was itself an act which was engineered and fostered by Western Europe in order to destabilize Russia. And like many such destabilization experiments, it simply went out of hand. And eventually the West saw itself with a new enemy in the form of the Soviet consolidation. But
so at this point, there is something that I would like to point out. What you're saying, you're probably quite reached at this kind of conclusion after a lot of thought. But I would like to, just for contrast, out of the raves and rants that Hitler was prone to, out of that, there were some themes that you can glean. One of the themes that you could glean was that he claimed that Russia had been always, governed by the master race, the Germanic master race in the form of the Varangians and later on the Teutonic Knights were a force which tried to stop the debasement of the master rulers into Slavs, subhuman Slavs. And further later, he claimed that, it was the Romanovs were actually Germanic in extraction, and a lot of the earlier Jurikids were Germanic in extraction.
Jurikids are the Vikings, essentially.
Yes.
Helga was a Viking. Yeah, Oleg,
and he said
Helga is his German name.
And he said that the communist revolution in Russia was a creation of the Jew, who is always set up against the Germanic master race, of the Jew, and supported by the greedy capitalists in America and Britain. The Jew went and corrupted the pristine state where the Germanic master race was ruling over Russia. So this was a theme of his, and of course, there was a lot of raving and ranting around this, but this was a theme of his, which is quite curious because there might have been a germ of truth in the fact that there was a Germanic, ruling class always in Russia, for a long time in Russia.
Oh, and I should also point out that even after Peter and closer to our times, there are the Russified Germans. There are some famous Russian poets. I'm not an expert on Russian literature in the non-technical sense, so I'll just state that I'm not recalling his name, but one of my friends on Twitter, maybe she doesn't want to be named in any public forum, had written a good article on Russian literature, and people can look them up if they want to.
Sure.
So one of I can convey that to you after we are done, if you want to link. And I could link it once you put up this discussion. So there were Russian generals who were actually Russified Germans, and these are not Rurikids or old Germanic settlers in Russia. These are more who came from Germany, Russia. Others, like the great mathematician Leonhard Euler, who is of Germanic ancestry, he was patronized by the Russians in St. Petersburg. And, I think he was in Königsberg. I'm missing. That is, they are the same, but I'm not clear exactly where he lived in Russia, but I believe it was in Königsberg at that point.
Even during the Tsar times, I believe they used to hire all these German, generals to come and teach Russian armies about what was then modern war techniques. Clausewitz was supposed to have been contracted for the Russians at some point in time, even.
Absolutely. And it went the other way too. The unification of Germany under Bismarck and the emergence of the German state was definitely supported by the Russians. And this can be seen as a symbiosis because there was a German elite in Russia. There were ties with the Russian royalty. So them paying back by assisting and aiding the unification of Germany under Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, was something which should be kept in mind. That that is, Hitler's characterization of it is an essentialism. That is, it's a one-sided essentialism where he presents it as the super Germans and the Untermensch Russians. But the reality was, yes, there was always a German elite in Russia, or there were periods where a German elite existed in Russia, and there was this crosstalk in which it was not always confrontational. There was also the assistance. The very rise of the modern German state did receive a certain help from the Russian state. But in terms of this idea of the West subverting and the Rus via the revolutionaries and the like Trotsky and others, if you look at the evidence, I think it looks strong enough, at least to me. I know that people don't like this, and these lead into certain controversial areas which may not be discussed, which cannot be discussed in public, because they cut very deeply into the identity of the Mlecha world. And unfortunately, we live in a world dominated by the Mlechas, where anything which cuts close to their undergirdings would draw a very strong reaction.
Yes,
from
and
them.
a lot of heartburn, because
oh yeah,
the worst thing that you could do to a Mlecha is to kind of, you can say all kinds of rotten things about their civilization to their face, but if you undergird certain things that they hold to be self-evident,
right,
if you undercut it, there is a very strong reaction.
Oh, absolutely. And there are certain things which cannot be discussed in public, unfortunately, unless we have a Hindu where we all can live under an Aryan rule. Some things simply cannot be discussed. So that aside, I would ask a listener to do his or her own study of the period of how this Soviet revolutionaries got established. And in a way, I even see such a hand in the French Revolution, that the English and perhaps some Germanic principalities played a role in fostering the French Revolution to weaken the French and to destabilize the French power. So likewise, the Russian Revolution definitely was fostered by the Western powers to destabilize Russia. And a whole class of such movements can be seen, the covert operations conducted by the West against other nations. They all have their roots in these kinds of movements, like those which were and continue to be directed against Russia. Even today, Americans, there is a strain of Americans associated with a certain political party for whom Russia is like the ever-present demon, which they seem to dream or have nightmares every night of Russia. Russia this, Russia that, Russia, Russia, Russia. That's all they talk about. So despite the fact that Russian power has greatly waned as of today. So anyhow, all that rant apart, in the end, I think World War II was sort of the final act in that phase of reckoning. So they were set back by the revolution, but now their very existence was challenged when the Nazi forces, led by some very talented generals, started making their eastward thrust. And if you read the accounts of the war, for the first few months, it was just a string of Nazi victories. The Russians were just retreating, crumbling before them. And it was then that turning point, like at Stalingrad, uh, the recall of Zhukov, amidst other things, and then the turning point at Stalingrad. It was truly something which aroused the Russian spirit in a way which only few nations have gone through. It was at an enormous human cost. I don't think any other country has taken that kind of death in a war. And it came out victorious at the end of it, despite all those losses. So it is something which, even for a neutral, I don't have a dog in this race, German or Russian. They're both equally distant to me. But one cannot, when one looks at accounts of the Russian defense, even I cannot fail to be moved that there was something very deep in their spirit of how they finally drove back the Germans and went all the way to conquer Germany or part of Germany. So it was that it was a moment in which nations are made, so to say, and very few nations are made through such a moment. Like Hindus have not gone through such a thing, and I think that reflects in our shortcomings too. After 1857, we never had a moment of reckoning. And it could come to us in the future, but I don't know if we would come out like the Rus. Unfortunately, these are events which involve a huge human cost.
So at this point, probably I'll go back to one of the things that we discussed earlier, and probably the significance, the significance of cinema and the visual medium in the 20th century politics. So around this period, the Soviets had started figuring out, after the Germans, after the Nazis, the Soviets and a lot of powers around the world, the Americans, the Soviets, everybody started figuring out the power of this new medium cinema for, mass propaganda and for population mind control. So Stalin really put a lot of money into it. He got Eisenstein, even before Eisenstein had made movie like Battleship Potemkin, which was again a very critical movie in movie history. He got him to make a movie around the defense of Novgorod by Alexander Nevsky. And there, how he showed it was like he showed the German Teutonic Knights invading, and he made them wear, clothes and helmets, which were somewhat reminiscent of the First World War German helmets. And they had them invade Russia, and they had a young prince, Alexander Nevsky, who stood up and defended the Orthodox faith and defended Mother Russia. It's anachronistic, and all of the technology is all dated if you see it today. But at that time, it must have been a really moving spectacle for any Russian. And what really caught the Russian imagination was the concept of not communism or Stalin or anything. Stalin or the Soviet elite is nowhere to be seen, even alluded to in this picture. It is the church, it is and Russia, which is shown, Mother Russia, which is in the form of the steppe and the earth. So that is what comes through in this movie. And Stalin had it made by one of the greatest movie makers of the 20th century, Eisenstein. And it's a different story that afterwards Stalin felt threatened and stopped him making movies after World War II. So what happened was Stalin had him make a movie. Stalin also saw himself, he had a mental image of himself as a descendant of the great Tsars, as a descendant, as a re-embodiment of Tsar Peter and of Tsar Ivan the Terrible. So he had Eisenstein make a movie about Tsar Ivan the Terrible. The first movie was very well received because it spoke of the greatness of Mother Russia. And in the climax, the people of Moscow come and tell Tsar Ivan, please don't desert us, our father, come back to us. And that's when, throughout the movie, Ivan the Terrible, the guy who's playing Ivan the Terrible, is a very stiff, very stern person. he permits himself a tear at the end.
Oh.
He sees that the people look upon him as their father. And see, Stalin apparently liked it till then. Then he commissioned a second movie, which was subsequent events after Ivan comes back to Moscow. And then he canned the movie because it started becoming more and more true to life, which actually showed Stalin's own internal image of himself. He saw it being projected in a different way as he himself, as others saw him. So he had the movie canned. So anyway, that's an interesting period, a piece of movie history. And Alexander Nevsky, if you ever get a chance, try to see the Battle of the Ice. So there is this where the two armies meet on a frozen lake, and it's been like copied in like I don't know how many movies since then. That scene has found referenced in so many movies since then. Anyways, that was a bit of slightly lighter historical information for our viewers. Please go ahead.
Interesting. No problem. Yeah, so I think we can conclude the Russian chapter, so to say. So after World War II, this the rallying effect of theirs was what spurred them or projected them into the superpower status. And a sideshow in most Western tellings of history, but a very important thing in my opinion was the assault on the Japanese. And this was something which they were waiting for. There were some incidents in the interim where they had shown there were the battle in Manchuria where they defeated the Imperial Japanese forces before the encounter of World War II. But it didn't really mean that they had gained back their pride. It was a interim state where they at least proved themselves that they could defeat the Japanese. But once they had cleared the Germans on the western flank, Stalin concentrated his whole force to smash the Japanese in Manchuria. And it was a brutal campaign. I think over 1 million Japanese were killed in that assault. I may be getting the numbers wrong, but it was a very large number of Japanese who were put through the meat grinder of Stalin. That's how I would describe it. And this was pivotal for the surrender of Japan. The Japanese knew very well that it was not the nuclear bombs which America dropped on Japan, but it was this assault of Stalin. And there was, I think, a raw ethnic hatred on the Russian side, at least. And there was a deep sense of needing to get revenge for that old defeat of theirs in the Tsarist period, in the last days of the Tsarist period. And the combination of this, along with a flagging Japan, meant it was a bloodbath. And if the Russians had their way, they would have definitely killed the emperor and imposed a rather brutal yoke on Japan. And it was the fear of that. They were between the devil and the deep sea, literally. And I think they thought they should surrender to the devil instead. The deep sea is completely impersonal and unforgiving and would drown the emperor and all that Japan had done to preserve its culture. So they took the risk with the American instead.
Which didn't turn out to be all that bad after all.
Yes, yeah, because the filter which the Japanese have, as I described earlier, it remained. So despite the American attempts to convert them to Christianity, it didn't go too far. And the Japanese managed to preserve their culture in the least. In a sense, I would even say that it was a Pyrrhic victory for Japan. They managed to preserve some degree of their old culture. They remained a heathen state. Their temples are still widely visited by the votaries. People continue to follow the old religion, Shinto or Buddha or a combination thereof. There are mantravadins still doing japa on the mountains. uh, as they may in a heathen country. And at the same time, they got their revenge eventually against the Americans by invading the automobile market and putting Toyota and Honda on the American roads and destroying the American automobile industry, or maybe destroying is a extreme term, but sort of making it lose its edge, the success in the electronic industry, so on. They can be seen as a victory in economic warfare, and some kind of state was achieved. Uh, Anyhow, that's that aside. But these victories of World War II, which came at an enormous cost, uh, in the end did propel Russia into a period of superpowerdom, which at least in my childhood days, it was not clear as to which paradigm was to win. At least when I was young, it was not at all certain. That is, we did in India, we didn't have all the information of the Russian weaknesses, so it was not clear whether it was the Americans who would emerge victorious, or the Rus, or there would be a long period of the bipolar superpower state of the world. The collapse of the Soviet Union was somewhat surprising, especially for people in India. Though people like me were sort of seeing it. I don't want to boast here, but I had already got a hint that this was not a stable system. And the roots of that decay go pretty deep. It ultimately lies in the fact that the Soviet system had many cracks, and perhaps in the long run it was not going to compete with a resource-rich America, even though Russia had its own resources. But in terms of intellectual power, for example, the Eastern European Jews and the German Jews who went to America could found an intellectual culture and give them the bomb. There were Jews involved in the making of the Russian bomb too, but it was never able to become that kind of a center which would attract intellectual capital from all over the world, which might make a difference. That was one factor you could see. It still remained an ethnic Russian power. And since then, it has been all downhill, unless, and you see some inward looking movements like the Vissarion movement,
Yes.
you may have. This peculiar, which is centered on a peculiar personality of a guy who calls himself the Vissarion, which is who lives in a secluded place, and it's a pro-fertility movement. So it could be that it's such kinds of pro-fertility movements which eventually come to dominate. But a Russian revival definitely is not on the cards anytime soon. That said, I think Putin has done something very clever to insulate the Russian economy. He has learned the hard way after multiple Western sanctions and Western interference with the Russian economy to try to pull it down. He has created a bunch of steps which has essentially made Russia quite energy independent and economically walled off. So in a sense, they are like the pre-Meiji Japan. They are in that inward phase of being walled off. They still have aspirations, as you mentioned, for the warm water ports, for the Mediterranean domain of control. And they have attempted to interfere in Syria, where the West has tried to overthrow Assad through their Islamic allies like the Islamic State. And the Al-Qaeda and the like. And the Russians, as in the past, have stood against these Islamic allies of the West. So in that sense, they still have some aspirations. But at this moment, I would say that they are in that inward phase, much like the pre-Meiji Japan. But you cannot write them off. I think there are other things which may play a role, such as global warming. I don't know how real global warming is. I don't want to get into that debate also. I really don't know. I'm just an ignorant person in this regard. But it does look as though there is some evidence that there might be global warming.
And the taiga may open up for large scale farming, you mean?
Right. So yeah. So global warming is bad for India, but good for Russia. So yeah. It has been said that even Genghis Khan's expansion may have corresponded to a period of warming and increased rainfall, the steppes, which allowed sustenance of greater populations. So who knows? Future climatic changes, Navyonmada, and the decline of America could result in a Russian revival in sometime in the future. But the biggest problem for them right now is demographic. And unless movements like the Vissarion movement and a new pronatal movement is able to shore up the numbers, Russia could lose parts of its eastern territory to the Han belligerents. The only thing which is maintaining the balance is that the Han demographic sucks, as the Americans would say.
Especially in their western provinces and in the more rural provinces, the demographics are supposed to be even worse than that of the coastal cities.
And right, and they have been hiding that.
Yeah, entire communes, they call them communes, or entire counties are emptying out of young people. Yeah. And it's just old people in entire communes and counties in Western China.
Even though it's fashionable these days to say that machine learning will fight the future wars, I'm still old school. I could be proven wrong, but I think it's young men who fight wars.
Yeah.
And neither Russia nor China have that supply of young men. So some degree of status quo is going to continue in that front.
So at the end of the day, on the ground, it is upper body strength, testosterone, and body mass, which wins battles for you. It was proved on the heights of Galwan last year. It's upper body strength and testosterone, and adrenaline, which carried the day.
Galwan was a particular regression where the Chinese came with a club which actually looked like a Shang era club with spikes, I must say. So that definitely put us back into the Bronze Age style of warfare. But you never know the machine learning back. This machine learning is the fashion. It's the fashionable word. Everyone has to utter it at least a few times these days. So
fifth generation computers were what I used to hear when I was in college. And before that, robos were going to take over our world when I was when I was a high school kid. So
it's like
these things
Elon
keep
Musk,
coming and going. Yes,
Elon Musk's cars. Chinese are going to drive such cars into the next battlefront.
Yeah, I'm still it's 2021, and I'm still wondering why I'm not wearing a spacesuit yet. Unisex spacesuit.
I would really like that driverless car that I can summon and take me where I want to go. Yeah. I really don't want to bother myself with the traffic or anything. If machine learning did the job for me, more power to it. But I still feel that warfare is going to be demographic. Technology is going to make a big difference, but in the absence of demography, technology alone is not going to matter. Like, say, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict is a good example of Israeli technology making the difference against the Armenians who earlier held the upper hand. But I think there are other factors. There has been an Azerbaijani demographic too, which allows them to occupy those territories which they have conquered from the Armenians. In the end, if people are going to matter, as I think Oswald Spengler, the great German thinker, would have called it the blood. So
Yeah.
you ultimately need that the blood flowing through real living beings to make the difference.
So, in another thing that I noticed about Russia, while we get to the closure of this discussion on Russia, another thing I
Yeah.
noticed is, as Stalin saw himself as in his mind's eye, he saw himself as a successor to Peter. I have
Hmm.
noticed another thing, that every great reformer or great person who changes Russia,
Hmm.
effectively take some ideas of theirs and just imposes their will on the people. For example, Peter the Great, before his time,
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
average Russian used to wear a kaftan, have a long beard, and wear breeches. He banned breeches and
Right.
said that everybody must wear trousers. He put a tax on
Hmm.
beards. And
Right.
that seems rather mild when you
Hmm.
compare to Stalin's collectivization
Yes.
initiative, which effectively destroyed agriculture for a decade in Russia. But in the end, it actually turned Russia from more of an agricultural to an industrial power. It actually created Russia as an industrial power at
Hmm.
great human cost. So, what do you think about this?
See, bad ideas have been the ruin of Russia, and they could be the ruin of America too. We see great parallels. Lysenko is a very good example for this. That Russian agriculture's failure, I would place a lot of the blame at the hands of Lysenko, who definitely was very close to the powers, that is the Central Committee. Lysenko had some ridiculous ideas of biology, vernalization, Lysenkoian vernalization, where he thought, just like the communist idea of people were fungible and there are no differences between people, they are all the same, and you can make a farmer into a computer programmer, so on, without any thought of the innate aptitude, so on. Likewise, he thought plants could be made to grow in frosty conditions by just making them bear sprout in the icy conditions, and you would have a wheat crop in the cold conditions, and so on. So this awful biology of Lysenko led to a catastrophic failure of their agriculture and enormous human cost. The problem was the socialist thinkers were so invested in it that they could not even see that this nonsense is going to result in a disaster. The same thing you saw in China with Mao. He had a program to kill all sparrows,
Yeah, kill
and
sparrows and have, people's backyards, they used to have miniature steel plants to produce steel.
yeah, yeah, that was even more. That
Ridiculous.
style of industrialization was, yeah, was perhaps it was a regression even before the Neolithic, though there was no steel then to make. After all, our whole metallurgical technology comes from traditions where there was centralized, huge metal production centers, like amidst our own ancestors of the Indo-European lineage of our ancestry. Perhaps even the Harappan lineage, I know less of whether they did so or not. But anyhow, that's a different thing. But this when bad ideas take root, they can have disastrous consequences, especially when you have the blinders of a system like socialism. So the big problem was socialism was not agile enough to see that a bad biology like that of Lysenko could translate shortly uh, into millions of human deaths. And like same with Mao and his sparrow killing nature. Now, in America, you see that happening today. The same anti-biological sentiment of Navyonmada and the denial of biology even in medical schools. You don't have women, but you have chest feeding people, and so on. So it can hit the US in the near future. I don't know how it's going to go, but it's quite a possibility. And India hence should learn the lesson, though I must say Hindus can be slow at learning lessons from the past. That these things can happen. That once you commit to bad ideas, the leadership, once it commits to bad ideas, uh, there is a certain tendency not to see the flaws of it. They would simply tell you that it has not been implemented the right way. And once you do it the right way, you will see the great benefits come out of it. Now, in the case of Russia's success, I would attribute it to a small band of visionary people, like the guys behind the nuclear program,
Right.
who
Right.
got that Lenin medal many times over, I think. So there were some people who, extraordinary scientists in their midst, who were able to reverse engineer the bomb for them. Then the early computerization, the adoption of computer technology in the Soviet Union was a remarkable story in itself. They saw very early on that to manage their vast resources and to administer the country, it would be important to have a degree of computational automation, which meant that you have to have invest in computer technology, including connected computers, though it didn't become the internet as in America, but the concept of connecting them and the like. So the Russian effort into computerization also was to hold them in good stead in the future. The importance of the use of space technology for weather forecasting and the like. So they realized its importance early, even if it was due to competition with the US. They also realized the intrinsic importance of that thing. While some of the space exploration, the man in space and all that was for show, but the technology behind it for forecasting, weather forecasting and prospecting through satellite imagery, all those was in spite of communism or in spite of socialism rather than due to socialism. It was due to those few visionary thinkers.
In a sense, we could say the same thing for the Indian space program or the Indian nuclear program,
yes,
or even these, for the the much reviled IT code coolies. Without them, you couldn't have such a huge mass of people, millions of people actually enjoying a middle class lifestyle in India. So all of these came out not through any planned or thing like that, but through just the efforts of a small group of dedicated individuals.
Yes. So the Panchavarshiya Yojanas of Jawaharlal Nehru, they did very little, and it was the individuals, the individual entrepreneurs, the individual thinkers who either within the government framework, like for ISRO, or as you said, the code coolies, to be very derogatory, setting up their shop, which was due to individual entrepreneurs. I think individuals matter in the end. Institutions help to nurture what the individuals set up. And that's what the United States was very good at until its recent Navyonmada crisis. And even the places where such innovation happened, like in the tech sector, have now been colonized by the new religion. So, yeah.
So that's a fascinating walkthrough of history, and I'm sure I've really taken up a lot of your time and your energy on a weekend.
No problem. Since it's on a weekend, it's okay.
Yeah.
It's it's okay. Well, thanks for hearing me ramble. Yes, I hope you have not been.
Oh no, it was a really fascinating discussion, and I'm sure our discerning viewers will definitely have much to learn from this episode, as we have had from our previous 2 episodes. So
Oh, if the feedback was positive, that's good.
the
Though I
feedback has
have
been very good. The feedback has
Oh,
been
that's
very
good
good.
to know. Though I
Yeah.
have my share of haters, but I don't.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah.
You're doing something good if people hate you.
Yeah. So we've had our own share of brickbats, but I would very gladly welcome any positive, not just positive, any constructive feedback on what we do here at Indic today. If there's any constructive feedback to help us make ourselves better, I would be very glad to take that. I don't like the abuse, but I ignore the abuse. So go ahead and abuse all you like for all you people who are going to abuse us out there. We just ignore you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you
Okay.
very
So
much, Manasataramgini, for
no
this
problem.
amount of time you've taken for us. Thank you very much again, and
No
hope to see
problem
you
at all.
again on Indic Today podcast. Namaste.
Sure, sure. We can have some other topics down the line some other day. Yeah.
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 Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Good
Thank you
night
very
or
much.
good day. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have a
Bye.
nice day. Bye.
You too.